Dan and I will now talk a little bit about XP and how we do it at Pivotal Labs. So just want to start with, so while we're talking, if you have any questions, please put them in the slide, or we won't have time to look at them while we talk, but at the end, we're going to reserve a big chunk of time to answer those questions. So we will definitely try and get to them. So thanks in advance for your questions. So, okay, let's start with, why would you want to use XP? So if you've ever worked in a traditional software environment, they're usually based around requirements, specifications, and trying to come up with the product up front and maybe 6 months or year-long plans. With XP, we focus more on responding to change. So that can mean two things, really. That can mean avoiding doing unnecessary work, and sometimes it can mean learning from users as you go along. And we really feel that this is a competitive advantage. Instead of being stuck to a plan, you can work to change that and as you go. Often for new products, we don't have enough information to know where to start. Sometimes we learn by talking to users that they use mobile more than they use a PC. Or if we're building, say, a recipe app, maybe they're more interested in having food delivered than cooking. So these kind of things we won't know until we speak with users. And XP is really built around this concept of constant feedback. Once we do have an idea of what to build, quality is something that XP also has a strong focus on. So in traditional environments, we have a QA team, and they do a lot of testing towards the end of the process. In XP, we use test-driven development to write tests way back at the beginning of the process when we're writing the code. And we also do constant code review with pair programming. So quality is a really big part of it. And I guess the last thing, and this is a really good point for you if you're ever going to work in XP team, is that it's very collaborative and modern. It's not built around the idea of making documentation and artifacts. It's all about shipping real software into users' hands, and you can see that and get feedback. You get to work with people in other roles and really sort of enjoy building a product together. So let's move on to the values and principles. And this is really the sort of core essence of XP. So the XP values are based around 5 things. And these are communication, feedback, simplicity, respect, and courage. And all the practices that we'll talk about in a minute are really built around making those values happen.
All right. Our first value, communication, is really central to almost all of our practices. Everyone on our team, from the product manager to the developers, are always communicating constantly. We have user stories to communicate the requirements for stories. We have UI designs. We share the results of user interviews. There's always communication going on between everyone. Also, we strive for that communication as much as possible to be face-to-face. You know, recent times have made that a little more difficult, but as much as possible, we try to have everyone in the same phase communicating together. And as part of that, as Summer mentioned earlier, we have everyone pairing, from the product managers to the designers to the engineers. As much as possible, we try to have everyone work in pairs. So you always have someone to share opinions with, to bounce ideas off of. So communication is really important. And that segues well into feedback, which is another important part of our process. We get feedback from not just within our team, but from users and from our tests. Gives us feedback on our system. So we talk to users, we do user interviews, we use prototypes to get feedback throughout the entire process. And testing gives developers feedback on how changes to the system have affected the overall code base. And we also try to give each other feedback as much as possible. So we're able to make sure we're delivering the best product, we're writing the best code, and we're giving the best that we can.
So another one of the core principles of XP is simplicity. And I like to summarize it in the sentence: build the simplest thing that works. We tend to build low fidelity screens and versions of features in our app first and get those out to users, and before we commit to building the more complex feature. We also try not to predict that what might happen in the future. It's often common in software development to want to anticipate requirements and get those in early to try and save work later. But we find that it's always best to ask the users what they want. Sometimes you end up with surprising answers. So we don't try and build anything before we've validated that we need it. I mentioned earlier about TDD, and that's a way that we can, at the code level, really focus on simplicity. We'll cover it in more detail later, but basically writing a test and then writing only the code that's needed to make that test pass really drives home building, just adding in the features that and the code that we need. And just in terms of software architecture and things like that, we tend to wait until we have a need for the more complex architectures, and we'll start off with a more simple one. And the last of the two principles, respect and courage, is really sort of helps bring it all together. Someone mentioned be kind early as one of our mottos, and it's a really core principle of how we work. We always respect the opinion of different roles. It's not a situation where the PM decides what to build and the other roles follow. It's very collaborative. It takes a lot of courage sometimes to put features out there and get feedback from users. And you really have to be ready to take that feedback and change direction. And that's another core aspect of XP. And the same courage applies to providing updates and progress to stakeholders. We try to be as honest as we can. We give weekly updates, but it's always about showing progress, not about trying to impress anybody. So now we'll move on to the practices, and this is really how we make these values happen.
So first we have a balanced team, which you may also hear referred to as a whole team. So a balanced team would, at the simplest level, consist of a product manager, a designer, and a developer. Usually for us, it'll be two of each, so at least two of each, so you have someone to pair with. But the reason for this is that you have people representing business needs, user needs, as well as technical needs throughout the entire life cycle of the project. And by involving each discipline throughout the entire process, we make sure that we are always considering a wider range of perspectives, as opposed to just siloing each step of the process to just designers design something, developers build something. We have constant collaboration. So we can always give each other feedback. There's always someone else that might see something from a different perspective than you do. And that might help us build something better than we could otherwise.
So another one of the practices is co-location. We talked about a little bit in the communication value already, but this is about sharing the same workspace. So we get together every morning and have our morning stand-up and talk about project blockers and progress together. And then we sit together in the same workspace, as you can see here, and we work together and communicate constantly. As you'd expect recently with more remote work, we use apps like Discord to try and simulate the feeling of being together, but we are still co-located in a sense. When we need to have larger conversations that would distract others, we use meeting rooms and breakout spaces. But the core principle here is working together and being in the same either real or virtual space.
Our iterations are usually 1 week long. So we will have a weekly iteration planning meeting. And the goal behind an iteration planning meeting is to make sure everyone has an idea of what work is going to get done over the next week. It's important to note though that this isn't a contract. It's not, we don't go over these and then they have to be done within that iteration. It's just to get an idea of what we're going to be working on. So the stories in our backlog that we go over in our iteration plannings are only ones that we're confident will add user value. So before we start talking about a story in an iteration planning, it will have already gone through user interviews. There already be data behind that story that is value to our users. So during the meeting, designers, PMs, and developers will discuss the story, make sure everyone's on the same page, that everyone understands the expected end goal of each story. Once everyone feels they're on the same page, the developers will estimate the complexity of each story. So something that seems fairly simple to implement might be 1 point, where things that are more difficult might be 2 or 3 points. Once we've started building up that backlog and started delivering stories, we'll build up a velocity, which can give project managers a rough idea of how many points we can complete each week. So for example, if we have a velocity of 10 and there's a story that is fairly low priority, but has a high complexity, maybe 3 points, the PM knows, okay, maybe I should move that further back down the backlog because there's some higher priority stories we want to make sure we get to first.
So once we do start developing, we almost always do it in pairs. So if you've ever heard of XP, you probably have heard of the pair programming practice. And that's basically two programmers will be working together using the same computer, but each having their own monitor and keyboard and mouse. And so everything from, of course, coding to deployments and sometimes even writing emails to important stakeholders are things that we'll pair on so we can get more than one person's ideas. And there's various ways to do this, and they have strengths and weaknesses. And I'll go over these now. The simplest pair programming method is Driver Navigator, and this is where one programmer will have the hands on the keyboard writing the code, and the navigator will give their ideas about how they think they will implement it. While that's happening, the driver will sort of ask questions and provide suggestions and feedback on the ideas, and that way they'll get two heads working to solve the same problem. Once programmers are kind of familiar with that, we often move to ping pong pairing, which is where one programmer will write the test and the other will write the implementation. And then we'll flip the roles around so that both developers get the opportunity to work on both the tests and the implementation. For really hard problems, we often mob, and that's where there's 3, 4, sometimes the whole team of engineers together around a big screen, and we'll talk about ways of doing it. So large refactorings, a very tricky algorithm, maybe sharing context of an important piece of information with the team, we'll mob for that. We don't use that tool every day, but when it's necessary, it's very useful. And probably the last kind of pair programming, I would call this the most advanced kind, is lightning pairing. It's a bit like ping pong, but the switch between the tester and the implementer is very fast. You write a test. If there's any failure, like a compilation error or a test failure, then you switch to the implementer, and then that will happen back and forth probably every minute. So if these are two experienced programmers, it's a good way for them to keep engaged and make it fun.
So there are some challenges when it comes to pair programming, but the benefits more than make it worthwhile. So for example, by working with someone else, it's very easy to transfer knowledge. So maybe you're working on an Android app for the first time. You pair with someone who has more knowledge and experience in that domain. It's very easy to transfer knowledge from them to you, and you can very quickly pick up new skills. Also, since we're always working with someone else, it fosters collective ownership of the entire code base. So everyone will feel comfortable fixing bugs, adding features, refactoring code. You don't look at a piece of code and say, oh, this someone else wrote this, I should leave it alone. Like, everyone is able to make improvements where it's needed. And also, generally any piece of code will have been seen by at least 2 developers, which means if someone needs to roll off the project, there's always at least one other person that has context on whatever they've worked on. Also, since you have someone sitting right next to you while you're working, you always have someone to brainstorm ideas with. There's almost always more than one possible implementation for any given feature. So by having someone there with you, you have someone to discuss it with, you have someone to bounce ideas off of. And there's also real-time code review. So we don't do pull requests. We don't set aside time specifically for code reviewing, because you always have someone there with you who's looking over your code in real time. And this also fosters a review of the implementation and not just the style of the code, or just like quickly reading over it in a pull request. And finally, not the final benefit, but the final one we'll be going over is it builds communication skills. Often people will say, oh, you know, like, what if I'm not good at communicating, or what if I'm more of an introvert? But, you know, pairing is a skill, and like any other skill, it builds up over time. So, you know, it's something anyone can do. It might not be easy at first, but you'll find over time it becomes easier. Some of the challenges, though, is that pair programming can be a bit more tiring than just working on your own, because you're not just thinking about the code, you're also communicating with someone while you're writing it. So to kind of combat that, we try to make sure we take regular breaks. So, you know, maybe take 15 minutes in the morning, make sure you take your full hour lunch, and, you know, just anytime you need a moment to just unwind and let your brain rest, you know, we make sure we take breaks. And also, you know, as I was talking about before, it does take time to get used to pairing. I know the first time people do it, it's very different than what they're used to. So for example, when we hire a new pivot, we usually try to have them pair with another pivot for at least a month so they can get used to pairing.
All right, so on to test-driven development. In TDD, we follow the red-green refactor cycle, and this really boils down to first writing a test and running it. And before running it, trying to guess why it will fail. And you'll end up with a red test show it because the implementation doesn't exist. So for example, a button, you might tap the button and expect to see some text. And the next step in the process is to make that pass. And as we talked about earlier, you write the simplest code that would work to make that pass. And now you'll end up in a state where you have green tests. Once your tests are green, you have the opportunity to refactor. Maybe you rename some of the variables, make it a bit easy to understand, extract some things out to a method. And we repeat this process over and over again, perhaps 10, 20 times a day. And that's test-driven development in a nutshell, really. Occasionally, we'll get into a situation where we don't know how to test. Often, if you're using a new API, a part of, say you're working on iOS, you've never worked with maps before, and you need to get some experience with it, we will use what we call a spike, where we'll write some code, figure out how to implement it. Then once we understand that, we'll throw that away, write the tests, and then follow our regular cycle again. Occasionally, we'll then codify that learning in learning tests, which are tests that test the APIs. And so when we need to look at it later, we know what the API is doing. There's really two kind of broad ways to do TDD, top down and bottom up, and both of them are useful depending on the situation you're facing. Top down allows you to look at the big picture. If you have an idea of what you want to implement, but you don't want to worry about the implementation details straight away, top down is great. So let's say you click a button and you expect to see something, you can start with that test and then gradually work your way down to the details. Sometimes you'll be implementing a feature that deals more with low-level business logic and edge cases. So then you might want to start at the bottom and test those out. Once that's done, then you can sort of integrate it and bring it up to the UI. And there's no hard and fast rule. We'll pick the style that suits the situation. The most important reason, you know, we do all of this is that we want to get constant feedback about what our code base is like. If the tests are hard to write, it usually means that the code could be better, and we'll work out ways to improve the code so the tests are easier to write.
And refactoring, the final step of the red-green refactor process that's often overlooked. So refactoring is changing the structure of the code without changing the observable behavior. And the purpose for this, as I'm sure most of you know, is to make the code easier to read, you know, easier to expand and to optimize, and make it easier to maintain over long periods of time. We strive as much as possible to keep our project in a state where we can refactor at any time. So we try to, we have our tests. We use continuous integration to make sure our code is always doing what we expect it to. And over time, by integrating refactoring into our regular process, it just becomes a habit and it's part of our daily practice. So we don't have refactoring iterations where we sit down and spend time specifically on refactoring because we've already done it as part of our process. So sorry,
Sorry.
Robert. Yeah. So it's over time, our code doesn't doesn't get in a state where we're like, okay, we need to, we need to sit down a second and take care of this.
All right. And continuous CI, continuous integration and deployment. We run our tests when we're working on them. Once we've finished a feature, we'll push it, and we have CI tools run the tests, and they might run integration tests or slower tests that we don't normally run locally. There's many kinds of CI tools, TeamCity, Bamboo, Concourse. We'll pick the one usually that the team is most familiar with. We also use it for deployment. So we'll be always deploying to an acceptance environment where product managers can check the current status of the app. And when we're ready, we'll also use the same tools, the same pipeline to deploy to production. We want to make it easy to do that whenever we need to.
And sustainable pace. Sustainable pace is kind of how we keep the wheels turning, by making sure we aren't burning ourselves out. We're able to keep going. As I mentioned before, we make sure we take regular breaks. We at Pivotal, we work 9 to 6, 1 hour lunch break. We never go work before or after that time. As you can see in the picture, we like to use ping pong as a way to unwind, take your mind off of whatever you're working on. So when you go back to your computer, you're starting fresh. And by avoiding burnout and making sure we're working sustainably, it helps us go fast forever.
All right, so we've got a quick poll now over on Slido. So if you've opened that up, if you could open that and answer the poll. The question is, which of these practices are you interested in trying out? So I might stop the screen share here and hand it back over to Summer.
Okay. Wow, we have a lot of, oh, that's surprising. I'm like, probably pair programming is the last thing they want to try, but.
Yeah, that's a really interesting result. That's great.
I guess because we all seem very nice people, Okay, let's just like 10 seconds on this poll. And after we get some results and before we go into break time, I want to just quickly just show whoever maybe missed the Q&A part, so how to use the Q&A tool. And then during the break time, please just put down whatever questions you have for the speakers. Thank you for the awesome talk, by the way, Dan and Robert. Yep. Oh, okay. Now the TDD is the most rated one. Interesting. Okay, let's see. So the next thing we're gonna have is we're gonna have a 5 minutes break time. But before we do that, let's just quickly come back to if everyone can get access to Slido. If you can't, just please ask in the chat, so we will be able to help you out. And if you just go to Q&A and type your questions, also you can read what other people's questions are. If you feel like they've already asked the questions you want to ask, please do that as well. So we can start with the top rated questions and then answer, hopefully we can answer as many of them after the break. Okay, perfect. All right, I put the questions here and then let's take a 5 minutes break. Hi. Okay, now I have the breakover. So I see people coming back. Just gonna wait probably like 30 seconds there. Please, if you still have questions you want to ask, just put down your questions on Slido. Or if there's a question you totally feel the same, you can give it a thumbs up. Okay, I guess that we'll get started. If you have more questions, you can fill in even while the speakers are answering it. So, yep, the first one is, what's a pivot?
All right, I guess that's an easy one to answer. Sorry for not explaining that at any time. So, I guess Pivotal, the company that we originally were part of, now VMware Pivotal Labs, we call ourselves pivots. That's just basically anyone in the company, you know, a PM or a designer, developer, or someone in a completely different role. So this is kind of term we've carried on, even though we're now part of VMware, we still call it ourselves pivots.
Okay, I think that just answers it. All right, I just click answered. And next one, are there situations not to do pair programming? Dan, do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, occasionally there are times when we might solo on something. Usually it won't be anything related to the code itself. You know, maybe there's some chore around something outside of coding that needs to get done that doesn't really make sense to have two people working on it. Or, for example, if we have an odd number of people, usually that's when we might look for some of the chores in the backlog that maybe it doesn't make sense to have two people spending time on. Then the odd person that day might take time to try to knock some of those chores out. Robert, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, that covers most of the situations I can think of. You know, occasionally, sometimes, just to give an example of the kind of chore, like maybe there's a flaky test that's breaking CI. Maybe one person would look into that while the you know, the remaining two pair. And like Dan said, usually when they're odd, occasionally we might do things like we've decided on a code pattern that we haven't had opportunity to sort of spread out to other areas of the code base. It's more of a kind of repetitive chore type programming task, which we might do, but we'll always, you know, get our pair in to take a look at it later. But yeah, I think, you know, it's probably fair to say like 90% at least of the work we do is pairing. You know, like I said earlier, even emails sometimes. But yeah, we do try and be flexible, and if there's something that definitely could benefit from one person working on it, then we'll do that.
Okay, guess that one's answered as well. Simon, do you have anything you want to comment? Does that answer your question?
No, that was it. Thank you.
Okay, cool. All right, let's move on to the next one then. How do you decide whether or not to use a mock module in TDD?
Right. I'm going to assume here you mean like mocking a dependency or part of your code in test. We often write end-to-end tests that will go from, say, like if we're talking about a mobile app from the view controller or a web app from the controller down to the database. We will, you know, in top-down TDD often mock as we go down, but we will have at least one test that sort of covers the full path, I guess, an integration test. But for our unit tests, we tend to mock that. Hopefully I've answered your question. If not, please let me know. And Dan, if you want to add anything to that.
Uh, I think that's pretty good. Yeah. So basically just, usually the kind of test, a unit test, you're going to want to mock out all the dependencies because you're not testing those. And then, yeah, integration test is where you want to use the real thing.
Okay.
Yeah, to just let us know if that was what you were hoping to hear.
Yeah,
free.
sorry, maybe you didn't put down your name, but does that answer your questions? Okay, I guess it's answered. There's no more questions. Okay. All right. What's the best tips to improve communication during pair programming?
Yeah, so one thing I would recommend, just even if you're coding by yourself, just try to verbalize your thought process. It might feel weird if you're working on your own to be talking out loud, but it's a great way to practice and get better.
Yeah, definitely second that one. Just I guess that's the first adjustment to make. Thinking out loud is probably one of the first things you could start doing. Even if you're trying to practice pair programming, I guess without a pair, you can sort of just talk to yourself for a little while. Sounds weird, but it'll help you verbalize your thoughts. I think like while you're pair programming, even if you're new to it, I think just communicating as much as you can and being respectful of the other person and listening are all good ways to sort of help the communication go smoothly.
Yeah, and if the person you're working with happens to be maybe more experienced with pairing, or maybe they're more experienced with whatever technology you're working with, you can try just asking questions. I think feeling comfortable asking questions is really important. And if you maybe don't know what to talk about, but you're looking at the code and see something you're not sure about, you can just try asking about it, and that's a good way to facilitate some conversation.
And just like add to that, I guess the driver navigator is probably the easiest pairing, one of the easier pairing methods to try first. So you could try that, and sometimes we use a timer, like set it for about 15 minutes and then switch the roles around, and that gives the navigator role, the navigator role will switch, and it'll give the person doing most of the talking a break, and then the other person can do a bit more talking. It's a good way to get into it. I think also that like ping pong pairing works well for sort of, getting communications or flowing between the pair.
Okay, I think that just covers these questions. Okay, all right, let's move on to the next one. Can you elaborate more on how you do story-driven development? This is from Simon as well. Yeah, Robert, and then feel free to comment on that.
I'm gonna assume this is referring to the IPMs, our iteration planning meetings, and the stories we put in our backlog. So usually, for example, the designers may have some prototype with different features that they're trying to get feedback on, and they'll try it out with users, get their feedback, and once they know that that is going to add value, then they'll work with the project managers to write up a story. Usually the story will follow some format of, as someone, when I do something, then I expect something to happen. So like as a user, when I click this button, then I expect to see some text or something like that. And then once we have our iteration planning meeting, those stories can actually evolve more. So as the developers and the project managers and the designers are discussing it, we may find that they're maybe with some information that's not in the story that would be helpful to kind of elaborate what's expected. And then the developers will point it goes in the backlog, it gets prioritized by the project managers. And since our backlog is always prioritized by what's most important, a developer just comes in, picks a story off the top, and they know that that's the right thing to be working on next.
Yeah, I guess I think Dan's pretty much covered it. I mean, the only things I can think of adding to that is, I guess that, I mean, neither of us are project managers. There's a whole discipline around that. There's a lot of work that goes into writing a story. There's a lot of user research that we often do before it gets into the backlog. It could be like weeks worth of work that the PM and designers, would be doing to really validate that that's a feature that's worth building. So by the time we get to it, we have some confidence that it's worth building. So stories always have user value. It's an important thing. So a story is always about something that the user needs. And I think like Dan's pretty much covered the process of actually implementing the story. The only thing I might add to that is that the as a user, I would like to format is a really good way to tell us what kind of tests we need to write. So we often have at least one end-to-end test that mimics the sort of story very closely. We'll of course write many more than just one, but that's usually the thing that kicks off the TDD cycle.
Yep, I totally agree with that. I think that just summarized what we do with our stories. Does that answer your question, Simon?
Yeah, just one follow-up question.
Sure.
Sorry, I missed the beginning a little bit. Maybe you mentioned that already. Would the developers have like a separate meeting to like discuss about the details, exactly how to implement that story, or does this happen in that iteration planning meeting?
Usually implementation details will be decided by the pair that's working on the story. If there's maybe like a larger decision that needs to be made that can affect the whole project, we might try to pull in another pair to discuss it. Since it can affect what everyone's doing, it's important to make sure everyone's aware that that decision's being made. But generally, any implementation details will be decided by the pair.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I just might add a tiny bit to that. And during the IPM, we try to get through like maybe 10, 20 stories in an hour. And we'll touch on implementation details only if they affect the complexity of the story and maybe a signal that we need to rewrite it. But yeah, as Dan was saying, it pretty much is all decided by the pair later on, and maybe in a larger group if it's more sort of significant kind of decision.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, we don't have enough time, so let's just do 2 more questions and then I guess we're good. Are code reviews completed by someone outside of the pair who implemented the code? If yes, is that also done as a pair assignment? I think this is a good one.
Yeah, it is a good one. No, which one of us will jump in first? But yeah, well, we try to avoid the kind of pull request style code reviews because we pair and we're constantly reviewing the sort of real-time code reviews. So I think that kind of eliminates a lot of things that would normally get covered in a code review. Sometimes, larger things when we need the sort of feedback or experience of other people and we don't feel like we have the knowledge ourselves, we'll talk with the other pair and get their opinion. Or sometimes we'll pull in developers from outside the project completely. Like often we'll have, several projects going on at once in labs and we'll sort of, we'll ask developers from a different project. So I think like the short answer to that is we don't do like formal code reviews, but we will ask for help. One thing that just came to mind that we do is a little bit like a code review is we have a thing called we call it a code and tell. It's maybe once a month or so, we'll get together with another team and on another project and we'll show them the code that we're working on and talk about some of the things that we're really proud of and some of the things that we think might need feedback or improvement. And then we're able to get perspective from another group. And that's sort of like a bit like a code review too. So we sort of combine a lot of these tricks to get code reviews without having the traditional like pull request, waiting for a response and, getting feedback on whatever the person giving feedback feels like giving feedback on. Is there anything you want to add to that, like Summer or Dan or anyone else?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. I don't have anything to add.
I mean, I'm XP native, so I don't know what is a code view. So, okay, I guess this one is answered. Yay. All right, well, let's just do this one and then we'll end the Q&A session and get into retro. How often do you shuffle pairs? Do you fix the date or depends on the task?
Yeah, so we shuffle pairs every day. So for example, if Robert and I were pairing on a story today and we didn't finish, tomorrow morning, either Robert or I would stay on that story to retain context, and then the other person would rotate off and be replaced by someone else. And by doing daily rotations, much more context is about the code that we're writing is being shared than if we have like a schedule like, oh, we'll rotate one person next week or something like that. So every story, we usually have 2 or 3 people that works on it.
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell, really. I guess the only thing I'd add to that is sometimes it's tempting to want to not rotate when you almost finish a story, but if you're pairing. But I feel like that's the perfect time to rotate, because usually when you do, you'll have to explain. Say you're the person on the staying on, you'll have to catch the person up who's come on, and that gives you a chance to sort of see, oh, this part of the code's a bit hard to explain, so maybe we should spend some time cleaning that up. And the person rolling on may have completely different experience than you or the person you're pairing with, and they'll say something like, oh, I know a better way to do this, and I know a API in iOS or whatever that you can call to do this in a simpler way. So yeah, just wanted to add that rotating may feel difficult at first, but it's definitely worth doing every day. Sometimes we do it twice a day, but usually once a day.
Yep, I think that's perfectly answered. Do you have any follow-up questions, whoever asked this one? Okay, I guess it's okay. All right, so I think we're good with Q&A sessions. Let's move on to the retro session. So, yep, so for those who probably attended our last talk, has already done this with us, I'm just going to briefly introduce what is a retro. And this is the one thing we do every week. And we do end of Friday, relaxing, have a lot of snacks and beer. I know we don't have that for remote, sorry. Yep, and we tend to write down what we think went well for the week, and then what's like, and then what went bad. So for me, I want to do this very quick retro, maybe just 10 minutes, so we can kind of get feedbacks from you, what you think you learned, or like if there's anything we can improve on, so we can run better events in the future. Just give us some thoughts. All right. Let's jump on this, and I will share the link. Okay, in the chat. So if you click on the link, and you can just start adding items to each column. The green one is the happy column. The middle one is like so-so, and then the red one is like, yeah, I wish we did that. I wish we have that, something like that. So feel free to add any thoughts you have about this event. Really appreciate any feedbacks. All right, let's take 5 minutes to write down, and then we will take probably 7 minutes to go over it. Thank you. I found out you can play the music. I think it looks good now. Maybe we can take one, just maybe 30 seconds just to, if you want to heart any comments you like. So we can have more, like, if you feel the same about the comment. Let's just take 20 seconds to do that. Then we'll start the retro. All right. I guess I'll just go ahead and start. And we normally start with like the most hearted, so most retail one. So let's pick this one to start then. I'm wondering about how to start adopting extreme programming into our team or department. Which one should I do first? Very interesting one. May I have whoever wrote this down? Is it okay just to say you're interested in this one? Okay, I guess it's anonymous. All right, Robert, Dan, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I can comment on that. I think it's always a good idea to start small. So I'd probably start with a small team, a small project, and then try and prove it out first. Usually, like when our clients start adopting extreme programming, they'll start with one keep calling them project managers, product managers, one designer, and two programmers to pair. And then once they're kind of familiar with that, they'll bring in new PMs and designers and developers and have them pair with people that have gotten used to the process. So it always makes sense, I think, to start off small and then prove that out on a small project. And once you get a bit of sort of traction there and people start to see, oh, you know, the XP is working out really well for us, then, you know, start expanding. But yeah, it's usually, that's the advice I would give.
Nice. Yep, whoever wrote this down, if you, maybe it's late, but if you stay after retro and we can talk more in our networking session and maybe just like exchange personal experience about this topic. Okay, this one's down. And this one, it's in the red column. I want to hear more stories about dealing with conflicts and problems of using extreme programming. I guess this one is for you, Robert.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, that's a good question, and of course, I can understand why you wouldn't hear about that. Yeah, I mean, adopting extreme programming is always, you know, a difficult challenge. You know, as we like talked about all these different practices, having, you know, teams adopt them is not always like taken with enthusiasm at first. That's why we kind of suggest starting small. Yeah, I think that, perhaps trying to think of the problems that come to mind that we've kind of resolved. But I think starting off small is always the best way, and try and solve the problems while they're small problems. As Dan sort of talked about a bit earlier about pair programming, and sometimes it's difficult at first. You're just working to overcome those problems while the team is small, and then expanding it. I don't know if I've answered your question well, but maybe we can talk about it a bit more later.
Perfect. All right, I mark this one as down as well. Yeah, you guys have just been too nice. We have a lot of nice feedbacks. Okay, let's just quickly go through them so we can go over to our networking session. Okay, the most hard-hit one, I guess this one. Content was easy and concise, easy to follow. Yeah, thank you on that. Before we had like a draft and practice it, is what maybe more dry than what we have right now, then just replace the content with pictures. Yeah, I really think Robert and Dan did a great job. So thank you for leaving this comment. Okay. Be kind, be bold, be honest. Yep. Do you want to take this one, Robert?
Yeah, that's kind of something that just happened while writing that slide. That aren't our official slogan or anything, which is I think it's more do what works, be kind, and do the right thing. But yeah, I think that those three sentences sum up our approach to respect and courage within the team. Be kind to each other, be courageous, and be bold, and don't be afraid to ask questions and make mistakes, and always be honest in your communication with the team and outside the team.
Okay, I mark this one as done. Thank you for the summary. Yep, and let's take another one. A lot of people interested in pair programming, haha. This one is from me. Yeah, it was like totally, I was surprised to see like so many people are interested and want to try out pair programming, because I thought it's like very controversial practice. So I would love to hear more about you guys as well, like what you think might be the challenges of trying it out later. Okay, and this one. Okay, I'm glad that the speaker used ping pong style to give us this presentation. Yeah, I guess Dan and Robert really nailed that. They didn't even like control each other's screen, but just use the ping pong style to like trigger from the slides. Yep. Okay. Sorry. I'm not good at English, but I could understand it. Thank you. Oh, that's really nice compliment. Thank you. That means our English is really like easy to understand. Okay. Good to learn many practices. Okay, thank you. Another nice feedback received. And other people doing XP as well. That one was from me because I saw from the poll, like other people are also practicing XP as well. So I'm like very excited to hear from you and what's your experience, since I haven't heard from other people who are doing it in their company. Okay, learning from other teams. Yeah, I'm not sure who wrote this one, but thank you. Maybe other teams miss us, so thank you for that. I knew the fundamental practices of extreme programming. That means the presentation is well achieved. I mean, the goal is just like to give you like a beginner test of how extreme programming works at Pivotal Labs and why we do it. Do you have any comments, Robert? Since this is probably the last one.
No, just thanks for all the filling up the green column. Really appreciate that.
Right?
Yeah.
Thank you. I feel so flattered.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and
Yep.
I just want to add thanks for all the good questions too. Like we tried to devote some time to questions because we knew you would have them. But yeah, I think if there's a little bit time left, you might still be able to ask more questions, and Summer and I will do our best to answer those for you later.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I guess that closed the retro. And thank you all that staying this late. Let's move to our networking, and I will show you how to use it. Let me send the link in the chat. So we will be using spatial chat. If you go to this link, you should be able to log in. Let me just quickly share what I was seeing on my screen. So it will show this page, and then you can choose camera, microphone, and you can have a name there. And then you just click join the party. Yep, you will have your icon and you can move around. If you move closer to someone, you can hear what they're speaking. And if you move further away, you can't hear their conversations anymore. So that's better for like smaller conversations. So since if we're gonna use Zoom, we can't really have more than one conversation, and then we're probably gonna put down more music. So it will be like a chill networking event. Okay, I will stay on Zoom, but I will mute on Zoom. If any questions, please ask in the chat so we can help out. Okay, let's all go to spatial chat. Thank you.